This is Damon Fordham, adjunct professor of history at the Citadel in Charleston, South Carolina, and I'm talking to you this evening about a chapter from my upcoming book called Black Folktales and Chronicles of South Carolina, which is going to be released by the Arcadia Press on January the 14th, 2025. And if you look it up on Google, you can make an advanced order for it, so it'll be in your home by the time it comes out. Now, the first chapter in the book is called African Prologue, and it talks about the stories that I found during my travels in West Africa that have a direct connection to the folk tales that are told here in America, or should I say used to be told here in America. One of the stories deals with how in the West African Research Center in Dakar, capital of Senegal, West Africa, we spoke with Dr. Ousmane Sene, who's the director and founder of that institution, and he told our group the story of how the Wolof people of Senegal and Gambia instruct their children and even use as fables to instruct elders about the stories of a wise rabbit by the name of Lok and his adventures with a hyena named Boki, and how Lok would since he was small and weak, would always have to use his brains to outsmart the greedy and larger Boki. The moral of this, of course, was that to help the young people and others to understand that oftentimes the brain is stronger than the fist when it comes to defeating an adversary. Well, it turns out that in 1874, down in Port Royal, South Carolina, down near Beaufort, there was a Massachusetts-born writer named Abby Holmes Christensen, who was on the plantation of Nathaniel Hayward, and she ran into an elderly black man on that plantation known as Prince Baskin. And Prince Baskin would tell her stories of how the African granddaddy, who was brought over here in slavery, would tell him stories about the wise rabbits who would outsmart the stronger and larger wolves and other such animals. And she wrote a book about it called Afro-American Tales Told Around the Campfire, which was one of the foundations for the Brer Rabbit stories that we enjoyed for several generations here in the United States. Another interesting story along those lines came from when we were visiting the Museum of the University of Dakar in Senegal, and we met a guy by the name of Mr. Abdul Say, who showed us this huge drum. And he told us that during those days, back in the days, they would teach the young men who were going through manhood initiation ceremonies how to send messages by beating the drum. And the only way you would know that would be to be initiated into a particular tribal group. Well, apparently this kind of thing had gone on for so long that in 1739, here in South Carolina, you had what was called the Stono Rebellion over by Ravenel, South Carolina, where an army of African Americans led by Cato and Jimmy, who'd been brought over from Africa, would go throughout the countryside, burning down plantations, freeing slaves and killing slave owners beginning on September the 9th, 1739, and end a few days later when they were caught near modern-day Jacksonboro. And it was after that that South Carolina passed the Negro Act of 1740. And one of the things about it was that, get this, they banned the beating of the drum during slavery after that because they knew that they could send messages. Is that deep or what? Well, another interesting story with an interesting connection came to me from one of the storytellers of Gambia, who told me that his great-great-grandfather, or several generations back, had the audacity to sell his own brother to the slave traders. Well, get this. A lot of those Gambians wound up in South Carolina. And in 1928, there was Dr. Edward C.L. Adams, who was collecting stories from the black people who worked on his plantation back in 1928. And one of the storytellers was a man named Thaddeus Gooden over where in Columbia around the Sand Hills area. And he told the story about how there was an African chief who sold his own people to the slavers. And when he died, the Lord in his infinite wisdom decided that he was too bad for hell and that he would spend the rest of his life as King Buzzard, flying around the earth and feasting on the dead. Is that deep or what? And so these type of stories I collected in the first chapter called African Prologue of my book, Black Folktales and Chronicles of South Carolina, that'll be out in January. And that's just some of the stories from that chapter that I've included to talk to you about in this video, to let you understand just how deep this connection between the culture of Africa is to the culture of America. And for people who say, well, we didn't lose a thing in Africa, Malcolm said, you lost your mind in Africa. Well, what I experienced in Africa from these stories and connecting them to the stories here in America shows that Malcolm was onto something. This is Damon Fordham.